And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Dare Dallas webinar. Now, this is the third webinar in a series where I'll be talking to a veritable cornucopia of some of the world's most respected specialists about items, artists, and areas that they love. My name is Alastair Meiklejon, and this week I'm talking to a very good friend of mine, Jonathan Horwich, about just one of the subjects that he's written and spoken about extensively on, which is British sculpture. So good afternoon, Jonathan. Lovely to see you again. And Jonathan, let's start off with just a little bit of an outline as to how you got into this world and how you started working with art and sculpture.
It was all rather a wonderful accident. I was meant to be a doctor. My father was a doctor, my uncle was a physician, my mother was a nurse, so my destiny was mapped out. However, it didn't work out quite like that. But as my father and uncle and grandparents were all collectors of various things, and I'd been interested in that, I redirected myself towards what I thought would be a career in antiques, but ended up being a career in art and sculpture, fine art and sculpture, with my first job at Agnew's in Bond Street back in the day.
Fantastic. So your career has taken you to obviously many places in terms of be it galleries and auction houses and others to the of that kind of ilk. So what kind of in terms of your career has really kind of been some of the highlights within that?
I think it's the people and the pieces. I think that when you look at the art business, you wonder what it's all about. But it's about people as much as anything else, and why someone would want to own something, what pleasure they get from it, and what circumstances prevail to allow them to acquire them. Some people are surrounded by art from day one. Others at a much later stage, perhaps when they've got some money, start to look at it. I think that's the wonderful element of the whole thing. No two collectors are ever the same, and no two situations are ever the same. And it's very nice to meet people who have pride in ownership or have a legacy of ownership which they're trying to continue.
Oh, I definitely concur. I think it's a pleasurable world to be in, and as you say, it's the items are fascinating, but sometimes the clientele is just as fascinating, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, one of the areas, obviously, in the main area that we're here to talk about today is your love and passion for British sculpture. Now, a lot of us will know that Henry Moore is one of your specialist areas. So why do people relate to his work so much? And why is his work available and popular on such a multitude of levels?
I think that his work defines him, and it is clear to others. In other words, his work is what I would call signature. So you look at a piece, almost irregardless of scale, there's tiny, tiny pieces that would fit in your hand, and other pieces which would fill your entire house or be as big as your house. And that's the extraordinary range of it. And he is, I think, very much a humanist. I think he's a man of the people, a very ordinary man whose passion for sculpture seemed to have been evident from the very beginning. And I think people relate to that. And I think the availability of his work is another aspect that it's often mystery to people who are not familiar with the art world. Where do I start? Where do I go? Where do I buy this stuff? Where do I see it? Well, with Moore, because of the quantity of work, he was an incredibly busy man, finding source material all the time, working all the time, grafting to produce more and more sculpture. It is available. So, if you and I set ourselves the task of buying a small piece by Moore, by the end of today, we could probably do it.
Right. So in terms of the availability and why his work is available so much, is that down to the popularity or in his lifetime, or is that down to the popularity in general now, would you say?
It's both, really. He was popular in his lifetime. He likes many things. We all need a bit of luck, whether we're actors or artists or business people. And with Henry Moore, he started off with no obvious luck, that he was a relatively poor family in outside Leeds, and he served in the First World War, and then unluckily, but as it turns out luckily, he was gassed in 1917.
Oh gosh.
So he was only a young lad. He was only 16, 17. He was only 17, so he was invalided out effectively, and the war had ended by the time he was feeling better. However, he was given some compensation. So instead of not being able to afford to go to Leeds School of Art, he was able to go to Leeds School of Art because he was given his compensation money.
Fantastic.
And so, this sort of rather misfortune turned into good fortune. He excelled, and he was inspired so many in the early days by Mayan or South American sculpture, but as time progressed, he became really very much involved with figurative sculpture. So the mother and child is a recurring theme. The single,
a very, very well-known subject, obviously, that he's done quite extensively.
Yeah, so his work became recognizable. So as time went on, as he produced more and more work, we all influenced each other as human beings. And so people who could collect would see a piece. I would see something in your home, which I liked, and then I could see something else that Moore had made, which was similar. So somehow it snowballed. People saw work either on display outside or in other people's homes and felt comfortable owning this great sculptor's work.
Fantastic. Now, another artist you've written quite a lot about is obviously Barbara Hepworth, and the somewhat tortuous relationship that they possibly had with each other. Now, what can you tell us a little bit more about Barbara Hepworth? And was there this famous rivalry that people talk about? Was it underplayed? Was it overplayed? What would you say?
I think it was there. I think you're right. It's difficult. I don't think they were ever really aware of it, but somehow they must have been. They were born 5 years apart and 8 miles apart. So Hepworth in Wakefield and Moore in Leeds. And that 5 years may have made a difference. So in effect, if you look at it, Henry Moore was born a Victorian. He was born in 1898 and Barbara Hepworth in 1903. So she's an Edwardian, arguably a more modern person in some ways. And the running saw, if you like, between the two over the years was that Moore regarded Barbara Hepworth as an abstract sculptor. However, if you look at much of her work, yes, it's abstracted, but much later on, in between, certainly before the Second World War, then they're very, very similar. They are both producing similar works. I think you're right. There was an element of rivalry, and bear in mind, Henry Moore goes to they're at the Leeds School of Art at exactly the same time, but she's, 19, and he's in his 20s. So, and she's a woman, and he is a man, and he's a northern man, and he may well see that, it's a bit of an insult for him. So he's probably always trying to outdo her, and she, to her credit, is trying to stand her ground. She went to Wakefield School for Girls, a very good school, to which she donated a piece of her work, and the school itself bought a piece. So they're very proud of Barbara Hepworth as a past scholar. And she was, if you listen to her talk, she's rather ethereal and almost hippie-like, but she was very steely, very determined to make a career in sculpture.
Do you think there was a competition in terms of the materials they used, and not copying each other, but certainly taking influence from each other throughout their career?
Yes. I think Moore had probably got more money, so was able to use more expensive materials. Barbara Hepworth loved to work in marble, but marble was expensive. And so she couldn't, and she wasn't making editions. In other words, she was always producing unique pieces. That takes time, and it takes money. So she was sort of, in her efforts to be true to the material, that was her mantra. She always talked about truth to material, and she really wanted to avoid at all costs being thought of as someone who wasn't close to the material. But it was sort of limiting her, because she wasn't working in bronze like Moore was. The flow of funds through was more limited. So and I
suppose, Jonathan, the practicality of working in marble is nowhere near as, I'm not saying easy, but the saleability of bronze and the production and the transportation of bronze, I imagine, is somewhat easier than it would be to transport marble around the world.
Yes, you're quite right. If you're going to get your reputation spread, then it's very complicated to send unique pieces of marble around the world to show people what you can do. However, if you cast in bronze, then not only is it much more easy to send this stuff around because it's much more stable and packable, it also enables you to build your business. So you can send one of the editions of your cast and then wait for the orders to come in for others. So in pure economics, it's a much better and more satisfactory way of dealing with these things, yes.
Fantastic. Well, we'll come back to the economics of it all in a little while. But first of all, let's have a brief chat about Dame Elizabeth Frink, who now I've been really, really privileged to see some absolutely stunning large-scale pieces in private hands, and can see how that kind of tactile nature, it is really appealing, and people want to embrace it almost physically. I mean, what can you tell us about Dame Elizabeth Frink and some of the work that she's done?
She's a different person, but also rather like Barbara Hepworth, very steely and physically strong person. It's notable that and I've had the privilege of meeting many sculptors, and I'm always impressed by their sheer physical strength. And you look at Elizabeth Frink's hands, they literally are like big pork sausages. She's a very strong and powerful individual. And she responded to animals in the same way that Moore was responding to shapes and what he could see as shapes of the land. And Barbara Hepworth is looking at the landscape. Liz Frink is looking at the animals that surrounded her. She was able to live on a farm. She was surrounded by horses, her own horses, dogs, and also the animals. She was particularly fond of the wild boar. And so her work depicts nature. I think she's very close to nature, and these things, when I visited her home many years ago, and the pieces of sculpture were sitting quite naturally in the landscape. So you look down from the house towards the lake at the bottom of the hill, and you think you can see a horse, but actually it's a sculpture of a horse. You think you can see a dog, and all of the dogs, horses, and wild boars are dotted around the landscape. It was populated with her own sculpture.
So the source materials for many of the artists, whilst they weren't exactly the same, they obviously drew similar influences from similar areas, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. They responded to what they could see, Moore responded to what he could find. And his, if you can imagine that we have our, people have their jobs, they have their 9 to 5. For a sculptor or an artist, it's always a search for material, things that will give you ideas to make work that will appeal to people. And sometimes maybe that doesn't work, but generally a sculptor is always thinking about what the next piece will be, always thinking, always working, and always looking for ideas. So they're always looking around, they're looking over their shoulder and over your shoulder if they're talking to you for new ideas and new ways to make work.
And that leads us on fantastically, actually, in terms of making the work and the next ideas. Now, did they always make the work themselves, or was there a team behind them in terms of manufacturing these pieces?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is practically impossible to do it all on your own. Barbara Hepworth was freaked out by the idea that anybody would think that anybody other than her was making this work, but she couldn't possibly make it all. So she had a little sort of coterie of people working with her, including the wonderful Sir Terry Frost, who, as a painter in his own right, worked for Barbara down in St Ives. And so there would be, she would make the model, the maquette as it's called, and then the studio assistants, or mostly artists, and very often graduates from the Royal College of Art, just like Henry Moore, just like Barbara Hepworth, would work to help make the piece itself. Henry Moore famously had a much larger studio, so there were people everywhere. If you go to his house in Hertfordshire, there's 5 or 6 different buildings with various people doing various things, building up the plasterwork for him. And that makes sort of perfect sense. And there's nothing new in that. If you go back to the antique, to Roman and Greek times, then there's going to be a group of people producing bronzes. But the only one who was freaked out probably was Barbara Hepworth. She would tell Terry Frost to go and hide when anybody came to the studio. So she would gracefully glide around showing that piece. And Terry remembers hiding behind a huge yucca plant because an important collector had just arrived, and they all had to hide until he had gone away. But Liz Frink worked in a studio in the house. So for her, her journey to work was about 3 meters from her back door. She had a big, I guess you would call it a shed or a mini barn, which was full of plaster. And then once the molds ready to go off to be cast, then they were worked on by a team, usually at Morris Singer. All 3 of them used Morris Singer for the most part in Basingstoke. So the ownership of the idea is the key. So each of these sculptors, their original idea is then built up using the skills and ability of a team of people.
Wow. Now, whilst we're talking about the items that were made and the way in which they're made, what's the difference between, let's say, artist copies and certain runs of pieces and certain sizes of pieces? How does that work, and what effect does that have on the value of these items?
I think the artist copy is a tradition which goes back probably to the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century. So it's a relatively new phenomenon. And in the case, if we took Elizabeth Frink as an example, generally speaking, the pieces, larger pieces, are in shorter runs simply by virtue of the cost of producing them. So a large full-size horse by Elizabeth Frink probably would cost £70,000 to £80,000 to cast. So they tend to be in editions of 3. So there are 4. I hope I can explain this properly to you. There are 3 in the edition and an artist copy. So that makes 4. And the artist copy is the artist copy. It's as simple as that, and belongs to the artist. So it's sort of an inverted form of payment. In Liz Frink's case, they're often available for sale and would command a slight premium because there's only one artist copy. And if it's an edition, a smaller piece with an edition of 8, so there's a degree of exclusivity. But I don't know how much more it's worth. It could be 10 or 20% or more sometimes. But there's a premium attached to that. Famously, Henry Moore had kept all of his artists' copies, and they were, if you think about it, an asset if you don't sell them. But then towards the end of his life, he created the Henry Moore Foundation, which is a charitable trust. And when he died, there was the inevitable argument between Mary Moore, Henry Moore's daughter, and the foundation. The foundation said the artist copies belong to us. And Mary Moore said, well, actually, no, they belong to me. They belong to my father. And so it can cause complications, if you see what I mean. There are various claims. Inevitably, those sort of things end up being settled. But the artist copy is a very valuable part of the whole commercial aspect of making sculpture.
Talking about the commerciality of it, one could say, how successful were the artists actually within their lifetimes? Obviously, we're talking about when Moore died and the issue with the artist copies, but were they successful during their lifetimes, including Frink and Hepworth?
Yes, I think hugely so. Henry Moore was a millionaire. Unluckily for him, he was a millionaire at a time when tax rates were high. So in 1977, he earned from selling sculpture over £1 million. So I worked out between 1.3 and 1.5 million pounds in a year. He earned through selling his work, which is not a bad achievement. The downside for him was, poor thing, that tax rates were high. He was paying 83% tax on that. So in 1977, he was the single highest paying individual paying income tax in the UK. If you visit his home in Hertfordshire, there's a photograph of him during a visit by Jim Callaghan, who, if I remember rightly, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time. So I can't work out whether... Did
he have a cheque in his hand?
He'd come to meet the highest. So, if you exclude all of the companies, poor Henry Moore was, yes, he was doing well, but God, he was paying a lot of tax. Barbara Hepworth was able to buy her house and studio in the 50s. She was a little bit behind the curve in terms of producing work. But luckily for Henry Moore, in 1946, he has a retrospective exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And just by virtue of timing, it's just a bit of luck, isn't it? That there he is, just after the war has ended. Everyone is looking forward, no one is looking back. The Americans just love this rather sort of quite good looking, quite charming and interesting British artist who's showing at MoMA, and he gets taken up. And Americans are brilliant. My father was American, and they're brilliant at taking up causes, and they just took Henry Moore to their hearts. And the Museum of Modern Art, yes, was showing his work in New York, but then he met Betty Warner, who was the wife of Jack Warner of Warner Brothers Studios. So he goes out to visit her in LA. She buys a whole bunch of his work. So other people come to visit Betty, and they like Henry Moore. And so one of the dealers in LA sets up selling Henry Moore. And LA being the place that it is, people follow other people. So he goes from being literally, not totally unknown, but unknown to collectors of the US, to being one of the best known and best recognized British sculptors in the US in probably 5 years. So that's, that works for him. And he involves himself personally. Over the Easter weekend, I've been talking to a collector about a piece which Henry Moore sold himself to an American collector. So he was quite hands-on when it came to selling.
Absolutely, yeah, it's fascinating. So really, that international market, for British sculpture, it's not a modern thing. It's really existed from that immediately after the Second World War period.
Yeah, it's like being a pop star and cracking America. If you can do it, then the rewards are astronomical. If you can't, well, then it limits you. Barbara Hepworth, there's one of her pieces is outside the United Nations, a huge piece. And so I wouldn't say she cracked it, but certainly she was recognized, obviously, in America, but later on. So she probably would be known in the US by the 60s. So she's about 10 years behind. So yes, she was very successful. Elizabeth Frink probably is more, not even European, I'd say probably in terms of collectors, she's better known in the UK than anywhere else, although there is work elsewhere in Germany and of all places in South America. There was a dealer out in Buenos Aires who promoted a lot of the British sculptors, Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth and Elizabeth Frink. And because of Elizabeth Frink having South African roots, when I go to South Africa, which I did last year, you see a lot of work by her out there. I think it just is by virtue of her roots, if you like.
Fascinating. Jonathan, how is the market currently for British sculpture, both in galleries and at auction houses? Would you say we're at a booming period? Would you say it's a good time to start collecting? How would you put it at the moment?
Yeah, I think it is a good time. It's difficult. You could always say, it's great to get into a market when it's at an early stage. But, this market has existed for, many years, and prices are strong. But then there's no problem buying when prices are strong. I think that the good thing then is that when prices are strong, then there is more choice. When prices are weak or low, then people perhaps are thinking, well, I won't sell right now. So you've got a good, it's a good time. So there is plenty of material out there. You can buy at auction, there's lots of specialist dealers in London and New York and all over the world for sculpture. So it's always relatively easy to see where the market is. Henry Moore, for example, comes up pretty much everywhere. And so, yes, you could look in the UK, but as you and I are talking, there's going to be a piece by Henry Moore at some size or other. And I don't know whether we didn't really talk about the price range for the Henry Moore works. If you try and think of an artist whose entry level price is $5,000, but the world record is £25 million. pounds.
It's such a broad spread, isn't it?
It's just, I just can't think of anybody who really covers that sort of ground. I mean, Barbara Hepworth's work is more expensive at entry level, and probably Liz Frink also, but Liz Frink probably it's about 10,000, but unbelievably you could buy a small head by Henry Moore, arguably one of the greatest sculptors of the 20th century, for $5,000. I mean, it just is extraordinary. So you couldn't claim that you couldn't afford it, if you like. If you're in the market for something, then there really are very few excuses for not at least starting with a small piece by Henry Moore. And then you've got the pleasure of buying a book in which you can find your piece. Each and every one of these sculptors, there's a catalogue raisonné, so you have that reassurance of seeing it not only in your home, but also in a book. And, you know, these days you can follow the market very easily. And
I'm assuming because it's such a well-documented kind of thing that, you know,
yes,
tracking prices and tracking the values of your collection is easy.
It is very easy, yeah. I mean, bear in mind, you go back to when we started this conversation, I ended up doing something which you could argue I'm not qualified for. I'm trained as a scientist, and yet here I am. So I have no background in art history. I didn't study art history. I simply was lucky enough to find something which I enjoyed doing and developed a memory. You know, either I always had a visual memory or I developed one. And so you can, you know, I can think back to something I've seen in someone's home 20, 30 years ago and think where it is in the house. There are various ways. And if you have a good memory, which I'm sure lots of people listening to this will have, you can remember where there's a story you can add to everything. So you remember when you bought it. You know, traditionally, I was first taught when I was in my first job at Agnew's was that when you first buy something, then it probably hurts a bit. You had to find the money somewhere. After 5 years, nothing much has changed. After 10 years, perhaps things have moved on and you don't remember the amount of money you had to spend quite so much. And after 15 years, you've probably forgotten what you paid for it. You love having it. And guess what? It's probably worth a bit more too. So it's a way of managing your expectations with regard to investment, if you like. But there is the pleasure of ownership, which I think shouldn't be underestimated.
Oh no, not at all. I think a lot of people gain so much pleasure from owning something that potentially could be, you know, a good investment. If it's not, you still had the pleasure of owning it and looking at it because you like it. And I think that's a very important part of any art collecting. Now, Jonathan, we've had a question that's come in about Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth. Did they ever meet, and did they ever express any opinions on each other? I think that'd be the interesting.
Yeah, I think they did meet. They met through their early days. Certainly, they were at Leeds School of Art together and the Royal College of Art together. So whether they liked it or not, they had to meet in their early days. And then after the war, Henry Moore became a trustee of the Tate Gallery. At that time, famously sort of moving, if you like, from very traditional to more abstract acquisitions. And Henry Moore was on the board of trustees. Barbara Hepworth was not. Yet they would both attend events at Tate. And I would like to have been a fly on the wall, because if you look at, what can I put it, the level or number of acquisitions of work by Henry Moore and the relatively modest number by Barbara Hepworth, something was going on. And famously, Henry Moore described Barbara Hepworth as an abstract artist. Well, you know, if you look at some of Henry Moore's abstracted forms, you could pretty much argue he is the same. So in I think it was 1956, 57, there were no works by either of them. But then as time progresses and Henry Moore's influence as a trustee grows, then there are more and more works by Moore being acquired by Tate. And Tate at that time is an arbiter of taste and influences UK and European collectors. So
it was actually in quite an influential position.
Well, I'm afraid so. Yes, I don't want to pour scorn, but yeah, you're absolutely right. In 1 year in the 60s, both Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth's works were being considered by the Tate Committee for acquisition or purchase. And in that year, I think it was 1963, there were 8 works by Henry Moore were acquired, and precisely no works by Barbara Hepworth were acquired, despite both being presented in equal numbers.
That's an interesting point, and I'm not quite sure how to take that or how to express an opinion on that.
We shall never know. They're both gone now. But I guess it's bound to happen. But I imagine that you're thinking of Britain in the 50s and 60s. Probably men had quite a say, and I imagine I've heard Henry Moore speak, and he's probably quite insistent too. But I think he was vocally quite dismissive, not of Barbara's work so much, but of what she was producing. There's a lot of contention. The perhaps less well-known these days artist, Sir Alfred Munnings, was famously dismissive of Rothenstein, who was then director of Tate Gallery, the Nick Sirota of the time. And he just was railing. So in Britain at the time, there was quite a negative movement towards abstract, and values were seen as traditional and not abstract. So I think it held the Tate back a bit, but eventually they managed to push back the tide of conservatism in England against this new abstract movement.
Jonathan, absolutely fascinating. Jonathan, just one more question, Jonathan. Where can you see sculpture every day, and where can brokers and other people go and see work by these artists?
Well, certainly in London, there's various galleries. Osborne Samuel, for instance, who are their galleries just off Oxford Street, will always have a range of all of the artists we're talking about now and more. We've just scratched the surface of 20th century British sculpture. There are also discoveries still to be made, so you can go to Bowman and Osborne Samuel and Sladmore Gallery as commercial spaces and go and see that they're obviously very knowledgeable, and all of the pieces you see are for sale, so you get a sense then of where. And for each of the artists, you can go down to, let me think now, go up to Hertfordshire, Muchad and Perry Green to see the Henry Moore Foundation. That is a day out to remember. There's a cafe, you can wander the grounds, and that, if you don't go round Hoglan's, which is his little cottage, if that doesn't inspire you to look at British sculpture, I don't know what will. Barbara Hepworth's house and studio became Tate St Ives, and her garden has dotted with her sculpture. So a trip to St Ives will inspire you in terms of Barbara Hepworth, but probably just sculpture generally. Liz Frink, there is a gallery space down in Bruton, Somerset, which now the name drops out of my head, but certainly it's possible to go and see groups of work by Elizabeth Frink. And obviously the auctions as well. There's always auctions happening somewhere in the world, but certainly at Christie Sotheby's, Bonhams and Phillips, you'll be able to see sculpture coming up on a regular basis. And I would say, if you're thinking about buying, well, just hold back, go and see all this stuff and see what really sort of reaches out to you when you see it. And, they are very tactile pieces, and I think that's where they differ perhaps from what flat art. Famously, as a specialist, inevitably at Christie's, as my career moved on, we divided ourselves into flat and bumpy. In other words, flat was the picture boys and bumpy was anything else. So I sort of straddled the two. So I was a flat art picture specialist, but also bumpy insofar as I was sculpture as well.
Fantastic. Jonathan, today in 2020, we're looking at these three artists. Now, are they seen as equals? Is there a top dog amongst them? Is there somebody, in terms of price points and everything else like that there is a huge difference, or are they getting closer? How does that, how is the market perceiving them at the moment, and how do you perceive them?
I think probably it's a 1, 2, 3. So I perceive them as Henry Moore is undeniably the top dog, the top banana, because of his international reputation. And you'll find that still, even today, as of this weekend, I got a call from someone who's working on an architectural project at which a Henry Moore work will be at the centre. So a 3 to 4 metre wide piece will form the centrepiece of an architectural project. So still to this day, Henry Moore died in 1986, but still his reputation continues to grow, which is amazing. So I'd say you put Henry Moore at number one simply by virtue of the quantity of work, the value, the huge value placed on a major work, £25 million at auction, so probably even more if you're trying to buy this on a retail basis. And then Barbara Hepworth. And currently, I think the auction world record for Barbara Hepworth is just under 3 million, so quite some way behind. And then Elizabeth Frink with a price record just shy of about 1 million. So there's a definite 1, 2, 3, Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, Dame Elizabeth Frink. And I don't see there's movement and progression in terms of prices, but that I think is how it is and probably always will be.
And the key question, I think, Jonathan, to end this little chat is, what's your favourite piece by one of the three? And did you acquire it? Have you handled it? And why is it your favourite piece?
Yeah, it's a good question. What is my favourite piece? I've been thinking about this long and hard, and I sort of I did at one point own a work on paper by Elizabeth Frink, which I love, but then the thing that I see more often than not is what I've come to call the Great Ormond Street Dog, which is by Elizabeth Frink. It's by no means the most valuable piece, but I've seen it on a client's home, in their homes, but particularly on men's desks. This is a little dog with the sweetest face. He's about 15, 18 inches high. So it'll sit on a desk, sit on a table, sit on the floor. I've seen them being used as door stops. And it was used as a fundraiser by Great Ormond Street in conjunction with Elizabeth Frink, produced in an edition of 50, which is quite a large edition. And initially it started life at about 10 or 15,000 pounds, but now it's not unusual for that same piece to make 150,000 because people just can't resist it.
Oh, I've seen them. They are absolutely charming. And as you say, but their rise in value has been astronomical over the last couple of decades. It's been absolutely insane, but that's fantastic.
I think it's a mark of, it's interesting, we talk about how tactile pieces are, but I think of the three, somehow Liz Frink seems to pull it off in terms of engaging people perhaps who are not necessarily looking for sculpture as such, but they're just irresistible. You go to someone's house and you'll see the top of the head or the nose of a little dog by Elizabeth Frink is shining because people can't resist stroking it as they go past.
For me, with Frink, it's always been the grasp of the subject matter that I think is the thing, and I think it's absolutely charming, and I concur with your choice of piece. It is an absolutely stunning little thing. But Jonathan, we're out of time today, but thank you ever so much for joining me. It is really, really much appreciated, and I'm sure everyone watching at home will actually just be fascinated as well. Now, here at Dare Dallas, we've been working hard with clients, brokers and insurers during this period to provide a service that works for all of us, including conference calls, valuations, videos, photos and many things like that. So if you have any questions at all or requests for future webinars, in fact, please do get in touch through inquiries@darevaluations.co.uk. Now, I look forward to seeing you all next week, where it'll actually be myself talking about what may be in your clients' wardrobes, be it fashion, handbags, or some other surprises. So look out for the article that was released a few days ago. You should have received that, and obviously an invite to that webinar will be included with it. So until then, ladies and gentlemen, stay safe, and we'll see you very soon. Take care.